Hello everyone, Thomas Riley from Medieval Review, and I am taking a quick break from all the DragonCon footage to do something that has been apparently requested of me a lot over the past couple of days. It's really odd sometimes how multiple people will ask for the same thing, and usually it's not exactly what I would expect. But a lot of news stories have been coming out related to swords, and people have thrown it my way and said, are you going to do a video on this? And enough people have asked that I figured I might. So I'm going to try a slightly different format here, and I'm going to move to something of a commentary on news stories. So we'll see how this goes. Maybe this will become a regular feature on the channel. So the very first story we come across is actually a story about a girl it's a very young girl, pulling a sword out from the lake, which is somewhat associated to the legend of King Arthur. So here's a picture of the little girl with the awesome looking sword, looking very proud of herself. It's quite the find. I would imagine any child to come across such an awesome thing, regardless of its origins, is probably one of the most exciting things to happen. I certainly wish that type of thing would have happened to me as a child. That would be really cool. The news story says England's got a new queen. That is, if Excalibur's legend is true. A 7-year-old girl in Cornwall, England, is making news after reportedly pulling a 4-foot sword out of the same lake that King Arthur's Excalibur blade is said to have been tossed. So for those of you who, of course, know Arthurian legends, know that on his death, or as he was dying, he requested that the sword be returned to the lake whence it came, essentially, and it was taken there by Percival, I believe, and thrown back in. Matilda Jones was swimming around Dawsbury Pool in Bodmin Moor, Cornwall, on Tuesday when she caught sight of the shining metal beneath the water's surface. This is what the Sheffield Star reported, so that's probably the original source. I chose this because the presentation on this news article has the fewest number of annoying ads. She was only waist deep when she said she could see a sword. Matilda's father, Paul Jones, who was with her at the time of the discovery, told the Star. I told her not to be silly and it was probably a bit of fencing, but when I looked down I realized it was a sword. It was just laying there flat on the bottom of the lake, he said. It's a great picture right here of him holding that sword above her while she's doing what I would call the Lady of the Lake pose there. Coincidentally, the discovery came just after Matilda's father said he told his 2 young daughters, Matilda and her 4-year-old sister Louise, the legend of King Arthur while vacationing in Doncaster. According to one version of the ancient story, Excalibur was presented to him by the Lady of the Lake. The powerful sword, which carried magical powers, could only be possessed by the rightful sovereign of Great Britain. And there's a close-up picture of the sword itself. Awfully clean looking, not exactly very old looking. No surprise there. I don't think anyone expects it to actually be Excalibur. And here they say, after being mortally wounded, the king ordered the sword to be thrown back into the lake, where it was caught by the hand emerging from the water. Could Matilda's sword be a thing of history and lore? Her father suspects not. Though its discovery makes for some pretty cool stories, he estimated it's only 20 to 30 years old. It's probably an old film prop. Now, that's probably a pretty good guess, and based on some of the other stories that were coming out about this when I was looking over it and doing a little bit more research, of course, it would appear that there were some films that were made in this area, near this lake. I'm going to find an awesome picture. I think that's a pretty awesome picture right there. So there were some film things that were happening, and they figured it's a film prop. And he said 20 to 30 years old. That's really pretty old. I mean, if you're talking 20 to 30 years old, you're talking about when potentially the film Excalibur was made. But in general, yes, this is probably just a cheapo sword that somehow got discarded. Film prop isn't a bad guess. I'm sure they source plenty of things. Thankfully, we didn't have to do too much searching. This news story was, of course, posted, or at least one version of it was posted on Reddit, and the Reddit sleuths, being what they are, went and searched for this sword. User Telepathic on Reddit actually linked to this link right here, which is called the Battle Sword of Jaim. I'm assuming that's how that's supposed to be pronounced. But it is manufactured in Toledo, Spain. They've got a $70 price mark on it. And so no real surprise. This is kind of a wall hanger SLO. Cheapo sword, but hey, someone tossed it in the lake, a girl found it, and it makes for a pretty cool story. So that's the light story. It's not the one that was mostly requested. The one that mostly was requested will be this one. Normally I'd probably do this type of thing with just a single news story with a little bit of commentary. But the one that we get is, one I think is actually more interesting, is this recent discovery. This was posted on September 5th. I believe the original breaking story was certainly earlier than this. Again, I'm going with the article that I think presents the story the best, with the least amount of annoying ads. This is from secretsoftheice.com, and they talk about the breaking news that a Viking sword was found at a high altitude. Here's a nice close-up picture of the sword, and we'll dive right into the article. This is from Lars Pilo. On Friday, we received the incredible news that a sword had been found at high altitude in our country. The discovery was made during reindeer hunting. The pictures accompanying the news were just stunning. One of them showed the hunter holding an extremely well-preserved Viking sword. Here's the picture. Now, initial reaction, I think, for a lot of people, especially this coming so closely after a story about a little girl pulling a sword out of a lake, and of course it being in a very good condition but not being an actual historical model, would be, well, okay, so maybe this isn't actually a historical sword. I think there's still a lot of discussion about this, although I think the debate is generally over. I think there's some wide acceptance that this is actually a historical find. We'll get into that a bit more. Our minds were racing, but the immediate thought was that we had to inspect the find spot as quickly as possible. The question was whether this was an isolated find, or if there could be more artifacts here. After consulting with the Museum of Cultural History and the National Parks Authority, 2 members of the Secrets of Ice team visited the spot yesterday, together with 2 of the reindeer hunters, including the finder Einar Ombach, and I hope I'm saying that name correctly. A local metal detectorist. By the way, really important, they're metal detectorists, not metal detectors. Love that show, by the way. A local metal detectorist and a local archaeologist. The group set out from a summer farm and reached the finds area after 3 hours of brisk walking up the mountain in strong wind. And it's probably worth noting at this point that this is actually far enough away from general civilization that a sword that is discarded could sit there for conceivably a very long time without ever being discovered. So that's kind of key item number 1, but it doesn't necessarily prove that it's a historical artifact. The reindeer hunters had not taken a GPS position for the find, but were able to access the exact coordinates through the geographical data stored in the photos. So there goes some meta tagging of photos being very, very useful. This was very important, as experience shows that it could otherwise have been very difficult to relocate the exact spot in a terrain of, with few landmarks using a GPS. The spot was quickly rediscovered. You can see this landscape is one that, yes, finding the exact spot would be very difficult. What did we learn from this from the find spot? The find spot is a scree-covered area with traces of permafrost movement situated 1,640 meters above sea level, so that's pretty high up. Einar Ombach told us that the sword was lying with the hilt down between the stones, so I would actually assume that means blade up, so point up, down between the stones and half the blade sticking out. He had seen the blade and pulled it out, and only then did he discover that he had found a sword. It appeared unlikely that the sword has reappeared to the surface due to permafrost movement of stones. That is, as permafrost has receded over time, the stones have shifted and uncovered this thing. And it is well preserved without any kind of scratches and bending. Most likely it was still in its original position or had slid down somewhat between the stones. Again, more pictures of the area. We surveyed the find spot closely, both visually and using a metal detector. The survey, which covered a distance of up to 20 meters from the find spot, did not result in any further finds. The sword is thus an isolated find. Now, something actually strikes me here. If they're using metadata from a photograph, generally speaking, GPS coordinates that are stored in photo metadata is pretty spot on, but it's not always 100% the case. And I would actually be a little bit concerned with just a 20-meter radius It's actually not that large, especially for metadata. I'm actually not sure what the modern state of how metadata is stored or anything like that, but it's certainly, at least they kind of searched the area. They didn't find anything. It's somewhat valid, although I think I would have expected them to actually cover a bit more ground. But one metal detectorist out there, it's a lot of time that they have to spend going back and forth. 20-meter radius, you're talking about actually 20 square meters, so that's actually quite a lot of space. The incredible preservation. It may seem strange for the sword to have survived on the surface, and while we're doing this, I'll play this video. It may seem strange for the sword to have survived on the surface for more than 1,000 years. However, to all appearances, this is what happened here. Isolated finds of well-preserved iron arrowheads are also known from the high mountains, and some of these artifacts are even older than the sword. The preservation is probably due to a combination of the quality of iron, the high altitude, and mostly cold conditions. For most of the year, the find spot would have been frozen over and covered in snow. The sword would most likely have had bone, wood, or leather covering the grip, but the organic parts are no longer preserved. No surprise, most swords are not found with the organic parts intact. In fact, it's actually very rare that you have that, and the few times we do, it's actually leather scabbards or bit of them that are actually tied to the blade. Very rarely is it the hilt components, although I do believe that has been found actually with somewhat almost nearly fossilized, and some, not really fossilized, but definitely very hardened wood pieces that have just not decayed over time. Why was this sword lost at high altitude? So what do we know? What do we know now? The sword was found partially slid into the scree with the blade sticking out. There were no other associated finds nearby. There are no indications of a burial or that it is some kind of sacrifice. It also appears unlikely the sword was simply lost here. I'm going to go ahead and note here that some kind of sacrifice, I don't know what they really mean by that. A sword sacrifice, usually that's tied to a burial, and a lot of times if it's not a sacrifice in terms of honor, or i.e. the sword is being sacrificed, it's usually a bent blade, and that's a really common thing within the Viking or the Scandinavian culture. They say, i.e. left behind for some reason and not recovered later. That's the lost part. What kind of Viking would have left his most precious object behind? A lot of historians will talk about this. Obviously, Viking-era swords are swords of high quality, that there weren't a lot of swords around at that time, so yes, they tend to be very valuable even at their time. And this note here is saying that the Viking sword is dated to about 850 to 950 AD, so you're really talking kind of at the, I call it the height of the Viking period, and that's actually the raiding period, so using Viking as a term, not as a people group. The rough scree-covered find spot is not a place where one would walk if traveling through the area, as there is much better terrain for walking not far away. This could suggest that the person who left behind the sword was lost, maybe in a snow blizzard. It seems likely that the sword belonged to a Viking who died on the mountain, perhaps from exposure. However, if this is indeed the case, was he traveling in the high mountain with only his sword? It is a bit of a mystery. It is a tantalizing thought that if the Viking had died a couple of hundred meters further east, where there were ice patches, we could have had our first Norwegian Otzi. As it is now, his remains are long gone, and only the sword bears witness to the drama that happened here more than 1,000 years ago. And they say if you're interested in reading more on the death in the high mountains, they have a blog post on the subject. So, there's a lot that can be said. I'm going to come back up to some of these more interesting pictures. I'm just going to come up to this one. I think it's a really nice close-up of the sword. There's a lot that can be said about the quality of this find, and obviously some questions about authenticity. What hasn't kind of gotten out is that there are apparently some scientific papers that have been written on this sword and are talking about it, and they do seem to validate, so archaeologists and researchers are validating that this is an actual ancient find. The good preservation is just the happenstance of where this is. A high altitude in really cold weather, possibly covered by snow, means less oxidation, less rust, and it's a very, very specific condition. just like a peat bog is a great place to find a sword, oddly enough, or really any bog, peat bogs especially. And so, yeah, this has some real good potential to be a very high quality find. Now, some people have looked at this. Again, Reddit gets this news story, get some Reddit sleuths on it. You get some really heavy hitters in terms of sword researchers and historical people who actually sit on that sword subreddit. And they've had some back and forth on this, so I highly suggest you go to the sword subreddit and check out this news article in the comments there within. But I'm going to speak a little bit to some of the conversation that has happened, specifically with the hilt components. You can actually see where the essentially the cross piece, or where the blade meets the grip, that piece is mismatched from the pommel piece. This is not a normal thing per se, i.e., this would suggest that the sword has actually been re-hilted at some point, specifically probably at the pommel, because usually Viking era swords have some sort of matching with hilt and or with the shoulder bit, the cross, for lack of a better term, and the pommel. And people have suggested, if we actually jump over here to some of the Peterson typologies, that perhaps the hilt is this maybe type C to begin with, and then was eventually swapped out with this kind of, I believe it's type M, here we go, pommel, to have kind of created a specialized sword at this point. So there's some suggestions that this was a re-hilted sword. I think that's a pretty valid concept. Yet to be seen. Hopefully we'll actually hear more news coming from this concept, more news stories. I think it is a very interesting find. And yeah, I'm interested to see what comes from this. Hopefully some of the research papers will actually be published. And I'd also like to commend these hunters for doing the right thing. A lot of European countries obviously have laws that say if you find an artifact, you should notify the proper authorities. Unfortunately, it doesn't always happen, but thankfully this ended up something that the world can appreciate and not just sit in some private collection, although I'm sure that is a very, very tempting thing. So yes, those are two news stories that have come out within the past week or so. And tell me if you like this type of video, if you like me just kind of talking about historical subjects. I know I'm basically reading the article, but I'm trying to interject some of my own thoughts here and some of the other research I've done past the article. Really interesting stuff, and amazing that we have two sword finds that have come up now within just a couple of days of each other. Let's hope we get more of this. Let's hope this is a trend. Let's go find more swords, everyone. Really cool stuff. Alright, this is Thomas Riley for Medieval Review. Have a good day, everyone. Talk to you later.